Hey guys, CB Super. Today's tutorial is going to be all on masking inside of DaVinci Resolve 16. I'm going to be using 16.2. This works in both the free and the studio versions. Let's go ahead and jump right into it. I'm going to go ahead and bring some footage down onto my timeline, and I'm just going to jump right over to Fusion. Before we even start talking about masking, we need to talk really quickly about the color channels and the alpha channel. This is a complete image. We see this as an RGB image. The RGB is simply just the red, green, and blue channels. When they're all added together, they create a color image or even a black and white image. If we want to click on the channels individually, we can always come up here to the media viewer and we can click on, say, the red channel. You'll notice that the red channel is actually a grayscale representation of reds, and it gets added to this green channel and added to this blue channel. And when they all are added together, we see the RGB, which is the complete color image. You'll notice that if we click on here, there is a fourth channel, that is the alpha channel. This is the channel that we're going to be working with mostly today. This is the single channel representation of transparency. So in that transparency, white indicates visible, black indicates transparent, and gray or grayscale, everything in between is going to be varying degrees of transparent. So if I was to click on this alpha channel, we'll see that it's completely white, and by default, all images are completely white because they are completely visible. Now, once we start to add some masks, we'll see that some portions of this will start to turn black or maybe gray, and that will start to change the transparency of our image. Now, if we look down here on our nodes, we'll see that in the node panel, we have a media in node, and just to the left of that media in node, we see this little blue triangle. That little blue triangle just means that it will take an effect mask or some type of mask, and you could load that mask directly into that node. It will affect something. Now, on some nodes, it will affect the visibility of that node, and in other nodes, it will effectively make a selection for which that node will operate. So if I was to maybe bring in a color correction node, the effect mask won't necessarily cut a hole in the footage, it would only affect the selection for that color correction node. And we'll show this in several demonstrations here in just a minute. So at its basic level, we have these four masks that are on our toolbar. If you don't see the toolbar, come up to Fusion, show toolbar. For this demonstration, we're going to be using the toolbar quite a bit. Of course, you can also find additional masks inside of the effects library simply by left-clicking on the effects library, left-clicking on this arrow that's right next to the tool section, coming down to masks, and you'll see that we have a few masks that are not on our toolbar, specifically the bitmap, the mask paint, the ranges, triangle, and wand tools. Now, to be honest, none of these are all that useful with the exception of the bitmap. We will talk a little bit about each of the tools in a little bit, but first we're going to go over the actual tool structure and how to operate the tools. All right, so to show how the mask and transparency work, I'm just going to click on this media and I'm going to drop down a rectangle mask, and we'll see exactly how that mask affected our media. We see that the rectangle mask is a white rectangle on a black background. The black background is the transparency, the white rectangle is the visibility, and we can see how that is affected over here on the right side. Now, if we were to soften this edge here and add a bit of gray, let's see how that changes. Now we just added some gray, which now has varying degrees of transparency. The inside is still a nice solid white. The outside is still a nice solid black. In the middle, we have a little bit of transparency. We can kind of see through his pants into the checkerboard background, which shows us that that is transparent. I'm going to go ahead and reset that. And let's go ahead and jump over to the Edit tab. And now we can see that everything that we did in the Fusion panel has actually transferred over to the Edit tab, and we have effectively cropped out our image. One thing you always have to take into consideration is that everything that you do in the Fusion panel takes place before any effects that you do here in the Edit tab. So if I was to come over here and I was to do some cropping here, and maybe I wanted to crop left a bit, well, when I come over to the Fusion panel, we'll see that that crop has not been affected because everything that takes place in the Fusion panel actually happens before any effects that you do in the Edit tab. All right, so let's talk a little bit about terms real quick. We have the alpha channel, which is this channel that only shows the alpha of an actual image. And then we also have the alpha matte. So this is the alpha matte, and the alpha matte is a culmination or is the sum of all of the masks that you use in order to create this alpha. Now you can create an alpha matte using things other than masks. You could use a green screen technique where you use a delta keyer to key out a certain color, usually green, and that would create some transparency. That's another way to create an alpha matte. This is a way to create an alpha matte. We will use mask tools or masking in order to create the alpha matte. So now that we kind of understand the difference between a matte, a mask, an alpha, the alpha channel, RGB, now we can kind of jump into the actual tools themselves, and everything should make a little bit more sense. So the first thing you need to look at when you're working with a mask is the resolution. The resolution of this mask, when it is connected to a media or some type of node that has its own resolution, the mask will try to conform to that resolution. But you also may want to come in here and check the resolution of your mask in the center tab under output size. You can either change it, leave it at default, which is going to try and adjust, or you can change it to custom. But even if you change it, it is still going to try and conform and get stretched out by the resolution of the node that it is masking. When you start bringing in additional masks, you start to open up new functions. So let me go ahead and bring in a ellipse mask after it. One thing that we lose is the opportunity to come in here and change the resolution. You only get that in the very first mask that you bring in. And this is now the mask hierarchy. This mask at the very top is the top mask, and every mask below it can affect the masks above it, but don't affect the masks below it. So this ellipse mask can affect the rectangle, but the rectangle cannot mask out the ellipse node. So if I click on the rectangle, you'll see there is no paint mode, but if I click on the ellipse and I go back over to the tool section, you'll see that there is in fact a new mode called paint mode. Now this is the mask's way of asking you, how do you want this mask to affect all of the masks that are above it? Now you have several options. You can come in here and you can play around with all of these Boolean options. Generally speaking, I usually only use merge and subtract, and occasionally I'll use some of these other like invert or average or minimum, but it's very rare. Usually I'll just use the subtract, and that is just going to cut this ellipse out of all of the masks that are above it. Now I say all the masks that are above it because if you had more masks, say if I was to bring in even another rectangle mask in between this mask and maybe make it a little bit different here, we'll see that this ellipse cut out everything that is above it. Not just the mask that is directly above it or the top mask, but all of the masks. Even if I was to click on this ellipse and bring in another rectangle mask underneath it, you'll see that this mask now merging every mask that is above it. So you can see the particular design that we're making here is actually affecting the footage because they're all connected. Of course, you can animate these over time if you wanted to, simply by using the time slider to go to the very beginning of the position. Maybe I want to animate the height and width of this node. I can come to a new frame and I can just readjust it, and now you'll see that over time it will change the actual shape of that mask. Now you'll do this a lot, and if for whatever reason you want to get rid of that, you can simply come over to the width, right click, remove the rectangle width, and then you can right click, remove the rectangle height, and that will go ahead and reset all of that back without having to come back and completely reset your node up here in this little reset button. So this is stacking nodes, and it doesn't necessarily matter what direction these nodes are coming from. This will still be the top node, and this will still be a node that affects all of these nodes that are above it. So even if the nodes are placed on the opposite side, it still works the exact same. By default, the way that my Fusion is set up, if I start to bring in nodes that are not connected to anything, they will move horizontally, versus if I have a node, if I disconnect this and I just move this, actually I'll just go ahead and delete that. If this node is connected and I start bringing in nodes, you'll see that it moves vertically. You can change how it brings them in, but to be honest, it doesn't really matter. So let's go ahead and bring in a few nodes, and we'll just start to kind of talk about how these nodes work, the rectangle and the ellipse tool. So you're going to use both of these quite often, and that's kind of why they're set on this toolbar. So inside of the rectangle node, we can change the shape simply by grabbing one of the corners. We can grab one of the sides, or we can grab one of the tops or the bottoms. It scales it uniformly. You can also come over to the width and the height and adjust it over here. If you double left click on any one of these names, what that'll do is that will reset it back to the default. You can also click on the little button that's at the center or wherever the default happens to be. Just as if you're working with a transform node, you can adjust the angle here. I'm gonna go ahead and Command Z that. We already demonstrated the soft edge. To change the type of blur that you're using is the filter right here. I usually leave it on fast Gaussian. You do have the option to change it if for whatever reason you wanted to. The level is how you're going to be turning masks on and off. You want to get out of the habit of just taking a mask and moving it off screen, because if you do happen to add some kind of motion blur to that, it'll be very apparent when you move that mask. You notice that there is this inversion. We already talked a little bit about being able to invert the colors, but there's also this solid function where if you click the solid function and then add a little bit of border width, it'll give you an outline. Now you can use these position and lengths to give that border a little bit of animation if you want, and those are completely keyframeable and you can animate them over time. So with the border width, you can always give it a little bit of border width and you can change the border styles. And that's pretty much it on the rectangle nodes. They're really easy to use. You can't really use them as motion paths, but you can use them as actual shapes. So if I wanted to create some kind of shape, it's a really easy thing to do. I could just bring in a background node, maybe give this background node some color, drive this rectangle mask into that background node, and now you'll see that if I go back to the RGB mode, you'll see that I've created a red rectangle. Now, if I click on this rectangle, I can go ahead and I can change the actual shape of it. I can animate this over time. I can make a bunch of different motion graphics type of movements. That's generally the way that you'll create just colored shapes. It's a very useful tool and very useful skill to understand, and the ellipse is very similar. So if we look at the ellipse here, you control the shape and the size simply by just moving it up and down. This will scale it uniformly. You'll notice that both the width and the height are moving at the same time. If I was to grab any one of these sides, it's going to do it independently. Same with the top, it does it independently. I can move this around, but you'll notice that it does animate the center. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on that. I can change the width and the height. You can change the angle, and this really is only apparent when it's not a perfect circle. Go ahead and Command Z that. Of course, you have the same functions. If you click off the solid and you give it some border width, you can now make little animations just using the position and the length. So that's the ellipse. The ellipse and the rectangle work very similar. So let's go ahead and show the Polygon Mask tool. The important thing to know is that when you create the Polygon Mask and you are already selected on your media, once you click this Polygon Mask node, everything's going to disappear. Now there's two ways to get around that. One is I can go ahead and disconnect this and then start building my mask, or I can actually just come over to the invert function and invert inside of the mask. And now when I start to build my Polygon Mask, we'll see that I can see both the mask that I'm creating, and then the only thing is once I connect this mask, it'll cut it out because it's inverted. So then I can just re-click on the invert, and now my mask will operate the way it's supposed to. So this is the Polygon Mask. You'll notice that all of the angles are linear, and if I want to change that, I can just come to any one of them and then just hit Shift S to smooth those out. In order to make it linear again, I can just Shift L will make it linear. I can change these tangent handles. You'll notice that they move together. If I want them to move independently of each other, I can hold down the Command key, and that will allow me to independently move these handles in order to get the specific angle that I'm looking for. I can smooth all of them out if I want by selecting all of them and holding down the Shift button when I hit S, and that will smooth everything out. Again, if I want to make them all linear, Shift L will make them linear. If I select all of the points, I can actually move this mask around. And one thing to note is that when I'm moving this mask around, if you look over here to the center, you'll notice that it is still in the center. This is a free offset that you get with the Polygon tool, which doesn't really seem very important right now, but when you start using a tracker in order to move this mask along to follow something, this will be very important because it gives you a free offset and you don't have to use an offset modifier in order to move it like you would with the rectangle or ellipse nodes. With everything selected, if I was to click on this little shape box up here or hit Shift B, it will give me this shape box, and I can go ahead and grab any one of these corners and I can start to scale it in a non-uniform way. I can grab any one of these handles here and I can just scale it in a specific direction if I want. I can click on the box to undo that. I can also hold down the S key in order to scale them all universally. The scale function works wherever your actual cursor is. The way that you activate this is by holding down the S key, and wherever my cursor is, I then hold down the left mouse button and I click and I drag. And what that's going to do is that's going to create a pivot point for which the scale actually works. So if I'm over here, like maybe all the way on the side of the screen, I hold down the S key and then I go ahead and click and drag, you'll see that it is dragging and it is scaling from this pivot point over here. So you can also do that with the X and the Y keys as well. If I hold down the X key and maybe my cursor is down here, I click and I drag, going to scale from this point or wherever I want it to. Where this is actually quite handy is if I hold the S key and I want to click from a specific corner, well, that'll scale up from that corner, which that can be very useful when your actual image is scaling from that way as well. You can also use the T key to twist your mask by simply holding the T button, and this will now be your pivot point wherever you click and drag from, which that's going to be very important when we start getting into rotoscoping, which won't be in this video, but will be in a follow-on video. You can twist from wherever your pivot point is, which that's going to be really handy. You're not going to want to have a lot of point crawling where this point will animate over time. It's a lot easier to just create your shapes and then have those shapes themselves stay the same size as much as possible, but then twist and rotate and animate in certain ways. One thing we can do with this selected is we can actually give it some soft edge. You'll notice that it uniformly blurs all of the edges, which that might be what you're looking for. If that's not what you're looking for, you can actually come over here to the Make Double Poly, click that, and now you can actually independently grab parts of your mask and you can move them out in order to just soften specific parts of your mask. All right, so there we have, we've just made just that top portion of it soft. And so you can do that whichever parts you want. This is nice, especially when you're trying to rotoscope things out that have some kind of motion blur. Of course, you can animate these masks over time. And the way you would do that is, let's say I want to move forward a few frames. Maybe I just want to move this point out. And if I go back, you'll see that the mask is crawling. Sometimes you want it, sometimes you don't. If for whatever reason you want to get rid of that animated keyframe, you can just come over here and where it says right click here for shape animation, I can go ahead and right click and I can remove that key, and that's going to remove it. You'll notice that we also have the second line because we made this double poly. So there's another option to right click here for outer shape animation. I could remove that key and that will remove both those keys. If I want to get rid of all of the keyframes on here, I can right click and I can remove the polygon 1 polyline. That will remove all of the animated keyframes, and I can do that with both the inner and the outer polyline, and that will get rid of all of the animation that is already. If you need to reanimate it, you can always just right click and animate, and that will reset the animation. That's the polygon line. It's very similar with the B-Spline. The only difference with the B-Spline and the polyline is you'll see when we start to actually create the B-Spline, we're actually just using points, and it is creating these rounded, softer lines that are created using this bounding box. Now you can create more points in here just like on the polygon tool. The only difference is no matter how many points you add, it is never going to be like super jagged, and it starts to get a little wonky. I don't use the B-Spline very often. In fact, 9 out of 10 times I'll usually go with the polygon tool over the B-Spline. But if for whatever reason you do want the spline look, then the spline tool is going to be the one for you. All right, so let's go ahead and use some of the other tools that are up here in the effects library. I'm going to go ahead and bring them all out. I'm going to bring the bitmap, the mask paint, the ranges, the triangle, and the wand. And I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this effects library and disconnect all of these, as we don't really need them to be connected to each other. First one I'm going to show you is this triangle mask. Now the triangle mask, in my opinion, is probably one of the less used masks, simply because all it does is it creates a triangle. You can't select all of them and move it. You can only move the points individually. The nice thing is that you do get to see the actual points over here on the right. Other than that, it pretty much works just like all the other masks. A little bit less useful, but if you do need a triangle, that is an option. There's also this mask paint, which again isn't extremely useful. It used to be more useful, but now that DaVinci has added a lot of the same functions inside of the regular paint node, the mask paint is similar to if I was to bring in a background and a paint node, make it so it can only paint white and it only affects the alpha. So in order to use it, you just connect it up and you can just start to paint, and you'll notice that wherever you paint, you'll see, your image will start to shine through. Of course, you can come in here and you can invert it simply by clicking the invert in the second tab there, and that will swap it out. So if you wanted to invert it while you paint so you can actually see what you're painting, that might be useful. I don't use the mask paint very often, except for when I'm trying to just finely tailor a bitmap node. I'm going to go ahead and delete the mask paint for now, and I'm going to show you the bitmap node. So the bitmap node is a very useful item that I use quite a bit. It essentially creates a alpha matte using an image, but not just an image, it can also be video footage. It needs something to be plugged into it, or some kind of image, in order for it to actually be visible. If I just load this bitmap node into the viewer, you'll see you don't see anything. But if I plug a media into the bitmap, now you'll see that it is actually showing something, but it's only showing a white alpha because by default, the channel is set to alpha, which means that it is looking for the alpha of this node, which we know because there's no alpha on this node that everything is visible, so it's only showing a white background. But if I was to change the channel to say the red channel, now it's going to use the red channel of that media node in order to create a mask. If I bring in this background node, I color this background node red, and I plug this in as a mask to this background node and load it into the viewer, you'll see that we've created this kind of interesting red background that will actually play through, and you get kind of a really neat effect. This might not be the most practical use of it, but if you were just trying to get something interesting for like a music video or something, this might be an interesting way to use it. The way that I generally use it though is I use it in tools, and instead of using the red channel, I'll usually use the luminance channel. You can actually change a little bit about this, the way that it accepts it, but you can also use a color correction node to do a very similar thing. So if I was to start to crush the blacks a little bit and then maybe bring in the whites, it'll start to refine this alpha matte and make it so the selection is a little bit more bold. And so now if we play it through, we get a much better selection and a much better looking map. The way that this works though is that this mask kind of works as a garbage matte. If I was to bring this in, you'll see that everything will be red here. And I do this a lot where I just want to garbage out maybe a certain portion of it, but still use the Bitmap mask. And if I was to move this over a little bit, now you'll see that, it's a little bit more red. We would have to still mask out his hand, but you can see how you can just combine different masks in order to get the desired effect that you want. I'm going to go ahead and delete that for right now. So very similar to the Bitmap node, there's also the ranges. So let me go ahead and show you how this one works. I'm going to go ahead and delete that one. It's very similar in that if I bring into the ranges, you'll see that it gets you almost the same type of effect. The only difference is that you have this spline editor to actually adjust instead of the sliders. So you have a little bit more control, but it's not quite as intuitive. But then you do have the option of actually choosing between the shadows, midtones, and highlights. So you can get drastically different effects by using this. I don't use the ranges very often. It's very rare that I'll go to the ranges over the color correction and bitmap combo, but it can do both of those functions in one node, which if you get pretty good with it and get good with this spline editor, then this could be a very powerful node. I just don't think it's very intuitive to work with this spline editor, so I don't use it very often. If you need the ranges tool, that's where it's located. The last tool is this wand tool, and this wand tool is not as useful for creating alpha mattes, but it is kind of nice for creating secondary color corrections. So the way that this wand tool works is, let me show you exactly what it's doing. When I click on this, you'll see that it gives me this little red cursor, and this is really like the only option that you have to move around. You can't make it any larger, but you can expand the range. What this wand tool does is it selects a color that is on your image, and then it creates a mask for that color. And you can increase the actual range of that color to expand maybe all the way up his pants, but it's contiguous. So even if there is the same color and it's way over here, it won't affect that color over there. It won't include that in the mask. You would need two masks and you would need to combine both of them. So this is interesting when you want to change the color of his pants. So if I was to bring in a color correction node, plug this media into the color correction node, but then use the wand mask as an actual mask. So now when I change the color, you'll see I changed the color of his pants. Now it's not perfect. You may need to play around with it. And the problem is that when he moves around, you'll see that, oh, we just lost it, and now we're selecting the color behind him. So you have to continuously move this to wherever the color is that you want to select. So you could either track it, or you could just animate it by hand using the selection point and keyframing it just like you would any other thing. But the nice thing is that you can get like a really quick and easy color correction. You'll notice that we see some fringing on the outside, so we might need to play around with this mask by selecting the entire range, and then you can even give it a little bit of soft edge so it's not quite as noticeable. The more you jack up on the soft edge here, it's going to start including colors that are inside of his skin tones because those are a reddish color. They might not be the same color, but they will start to include it. I don't usually get a very good result, and to be honest, I find that it flickers a little bit too much for my liking, so I don't use the wand mask too often. But if you are looking to do just a simple color correction and you want to use it just like a qualifier, you do have the option of using the wand tool. So that's all the tools. There is one more that I like to use a lot, and that is this background tool actually. I can create an alpha matte using the background tool pretty simply, and let me show you how to do that. First thing is I'll usually drop it down to black, and I will drop this alpha all the way down. Now you'll see that we have just made this a completely transparent background. So I'll use this a lot of times when I want to change the alpha of something to transparent instead of completely white. So that's one way to do it. We can also come up to the solid color and we can change it to gradient, and then click on the black point of the gradient. And again, in the alpha slider, go ahead and drop it all the way down to 0. And now if I plug this into this media in, you'll see that we get transparency essentially wherever our slider is. Remember that this is completely black and this is completely white. If we move this in, you can see that it's a little bit more apparent. And so we can get varying degrees of transparency really simply just by using a background node. Now this might not be super useful when we're creating an alpha matte, but it is pretty nice when we're using, say, color correction nodes, or if we're trying to create a backdrop of something else and we only want our effect mask to affect a certain portion of it. This was really only breaking the surface for masking. If you're interested in more masking tutorials, check out my channel. I have plenty of advanced masking tutorials that you can choose from. If you like this video, make sure to like and subscribe, hit that bell notification, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks.